Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Erin Hall. Thank you, Gordon, for welcoming us, and thank you again to Albert Combrink for bringing us into this space. Can we just show appreciation again to... This evening's a special evening, and it's been, if you like, gestating or evolving with me for quite a long time. Ever since I heard that Cynthia Bourgeault was coming to South Africa, which was about a year ago, and ever since I learned that she was going to be attending or leading the conference in Pretoria, and then that she was going to be coming to the Western Cape to lead a wisdom school in Grootegeluk. And I was concerned by the fact that she was going to be doing these two events, and there wasn't going to be an opportunity for more of us to see her and to hear her. So I thought, we need something, we need an event. And then about 9 months ago, Wilhelm Verwoerd brought a gathering together in Stellenbosch of people who are concerned with contemplation and social action, and particularly reconciliation. And Wilhelm's event, in a way, was around the text called The Cloud of Unknowing. Wilhelm has translated The Cloud of Unknowing into Afrikaans, and he was looking at contemplation and reconciliation, and how do the two marry? And at that gathering in Stellenbosch, we were studying The Cloud of Unknowing. We were also studying Cynthia's latest book, which is called The Heart of Centering Prayer, Non-Dual Christianity in Theory and Practice. So when I left that event, it was kind of obvious to me that there's a marriage here, a marriage with Wilhelm and Cynthia, and that the two needed to get together, and that perhaps this could be the event, the John Oliver Memorial Lecture. So the invitation was issued, and they both graciously accepted. Then at this last weekend, at the Wisdom School in Hood, my Afrikaans is not so good. At the Wisdom School that Cynthia was leading, I had really the first opportunity to sit with Wilhelm and to discuss what we were going to do here. And he expressed his discomfort to me that on the topic of contemplation and reconciliation, he was kind of a lone voice, and that this didn't seem right in the South African context. Zanele Khumalo was also attending the Wisdom School, and I've known Zanele through her work in gender reconciliation, and the two of us work together. I also know that Zanele and Wilhelm share a passion for social action and for contemplation, and it was kind of an easy emerging, if you like, to invite Zanele to be on the stage with Wilhelm and Cynthia. So tonight, to mix my metaphors a little bit, instead of having a tango and two dancing, we've got a waltz. We've got an event to the rhythm of three. Because in my experience, when things happen to the rhythm of three, there's a different vibration, there's a different depth, there's a different quality about it. So I'm really thrilled to be able to invite the three of you onto the stage to take us forward.
Well, I've grown up, very much in a, what you might call a Northern European contemplative ghetto, as it were, that very, very happily sequestered in my life, studying centering prayer, a great fan of, a great devotee of the Christian monastic tradition, a doing of work in the with some of the inner practices, particularly in the Gurdjieff work, that brought mindfulness and awareness into the practice. So I had been working on my own, sensing very strongly that contemplation as it's practiced is a beautiful, powerful tool for the transformation of consciousness and for the transformation of identity, but feeling a little bit restless because it's kept pretty much imprisoned, particularly in the Christian West in North America, where I come from, in the art form as a lifestyle that's basically built on lots of silence, preferably held in beautiful agrarian spaces, and that people who are contemplatives simply spend their time in quiet. There was always the sense that that this meant you abjured intellectual activity as well. Any thinking was seen as non-contemplative. And there was a very strong sense that contemplation and action were sort of separate pathways. Mm-hmm. And even though everybody says they're not, the cloud of unknowing shows you precisely why they're not. You still have, particularly in the Western monasteries, this huge division. Are you a contemplative order or are you an active order? Active orders go and burn themselves out doing good work for humanity. Contemplatives sit behind closed walls and shoo people away. So my sense was that something was lacking here, that what I tasted in real contemplation was not silence, but what lay beyond silence, which was the total unmasking of our usual sense of identity and orientation, and a capacity to be present at the world in a whole different way. The cloud of unknowing says at one point that contemplation roots out sin by rooting it out at its root. And its root is in the capacity or in the proclivity of human beings to get identified, attached urgently to their sense of identity, which is always too small a sense of identity. And then out of defending your identity, you fight. And you keep coming back to your identity because you think that's the only thing you have. And the contemplative path, if you follow it beyond the gated community of lifestyle into what you really have beyond it, is a rigorous unmasking of everything you thought supported you as an individual, and a re-gifting of what the root of yourself truly is, so that you can move forward with abundance and equanimity. And it's not even like contemplation just means going to some quiet place to pump yourself back up again so that you can be drawn down in the social fray, but that you really understand moment to moment how to draw your energy from the well and to put forth that energy. So I began to see that, which made me more and more uncomfortable with simply the formats that I saw proliferating in the contemplative movements towards long retreats with total silence and beautiful places. And with the help of a Trappist monk who helped me form it, we wedded together and developed an art form called a wisdom school, based on the ancient rule of Saint Benedict. That's what we were up to last week. Let me try it. Conduct. Did I get it? Close, maybe. Take a deep breath. But that rather than just seeing silence and solitude and inwardness as an end in itself, that it moves forward in a deliberate, intentional rhythm of moving out into the world, not just through action, but through prayer together and chanting together and all sorts of human opportunities for togetherness at a deeper identity. So it was that I got invited to bring here, and I promised myself if I ever got invited to South Africa, I'd accept on a heartbeat, because I've long had a sense that got more than confirmed when I came here, that in the pain and the struggle and the being right face to face with it, that you are in a deep and painful way the leaven for a transformation that the world is now painfully making, that my own country is painfully making. And I sense that I would find a heart and an honesty, a wisdom, a courage that I hadn't tasted before, certainly not in my North American silo. And I found that was true. We had a fairly short wisdom school, but what emerged, particularly at the end, after we'd had a chance to live together and be together and work the rhythm together, was a depth of touching of hearts that transcended gender. It had a hard time transcending race, because Zanele was our only official, non-white participant. But she carries a large space, and we were held as well by this extraordinary staff that just anticipated and were present to everything we didn't even know we were doing yet. So I felt like we were at a juncture of that new kind of human possibility that I'd ever seen before. My own shtick, which has made me really unpopular with a lot of my contemplative cohorts in North America, to say this, that when the contemplative revival began, in earnest in America in the 1980s, its focus was individual, therapeutic, and narcissistic. And that what I've seen over the 20 or 30 years I've been with the movement is that it has itself morphed by virtue of what's actually in contemplation into a movement which is collective and prophetic. And I think the next generation is going to be able to say that more and more strongly. And it's precisely in dialogues with people like the two of you who've seen it from both ends of the stick, that we can begin to collectively create a new understanding of what contemplation is in dialogue with the world, in its pain, in its needs, and in its evolution. So that's what brought me to Africa, both the surface text and the heart text. So I turned it over to,
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you for allowing me to go first. It feels appropriate, I suppose. I mean, for me, when I think of a short way to capture quite a long story, it really is summed up in the word apartheid, which is an Afrikaans word, actually. It's my mother tongue. But that means separateness. And as I understand the contemplative tradition and the wisdom of that tradition, and from many different faiths, not just the Christian faith, that at the heart of that is the unmasking of the illusion of separateness. So when I hear language like that, when you read it, when you hear it, it has a kind of visceral resonance for me, because I translate it as apartheid. The illusion of apartheid. And what does it mean, and what does the contemplative tradition contribute to the transformation of apartheid consciousness, which immediately roots it in this particular place, this particular time. And viscerally, I think, in my case, it roots it not only in my skin. I mean, I can't really quite see the skin color of people who are here, but I suspect most of you look like me. So it comes with this sociological, political phenomenon that with the color of our skin, we've been placed in these privileged positions of separateness and superiority often. In my case, it also comes with the language that I grew up in, the culture, the ethnicity, which was a really tribalistic consciousness of extreme separatism. And to make it a little bit more complicated, it also comes with my blood, in the genetic sense of the word. Because in my family, I carry the genes, I carry the tradition of the person who was the architect of apartheid, politically speaking. So I think that's why this is such a visceral, embodied challenge to actually say, what does this mean to be serious about a contemplative practice? Because in the midst of my own waking up period, which was really being shook awake by people of your skin color and people with very different experiences of the system that I grew up in, and people who hated my grandfather, and still do. To be exposed to those realities really became this wake-up call, politically, spiritually as well, because I was studying to become a minister in the Dutch Reformed Church. And most of my enemies were people who spoke English and were white, not even black South Africans. So all that history came with it. So I basically almost lost my faith. And it was through a discovery of people like Richard Rohr, Anthony de Mello, and eventually Thomas Keating, and the practice of centering prayer that became a lifesaver. A way of somehow remaining centered, rooted, grounded, in the midst of these transformations that I was trying to struggle through in my own life and in my family and in my community. And that's really the bottom line for me. That's remained the case. I mean, the journey has taken a few turns in terms of also working internationally with people in conflict. But the underlying experience has been the same, that unless my life is rooted in a regular, disciplined commitment to this contemplative practice, and in particular centering prayer, I just cannot do this work. And you just very easily become overwhelmed and scattered, and you want to withdraw, and you just can't sustain the work. So that's really the short introduction. And I think coming back to South Africa, the challenge, of course, is what does this mean in terms of reconciliation in this setting where my whiteness, my language, my family, my church, everything carries pain and suffering, symbolizes, embodies that for people of color. And so I was just really grateful to meet you over the weekend and to sense here is somebody who's also on a contemplative journey. And perhaps together we can struggle to transform this separatist consciousness, but also the separatist realities surrounding us in gruesome reality. And so I look forward to do that.
Thank you, Wilhelm. Yeah. Thank you, Cynthia. So, as Cynthia has already mentioned, I just happen to be the only black person in the room at the retreat. And interestingly, I often find myself in, predominantly white spaces. And I guess for me, and when I think about my life story and how I came to a centering prayer practice, I think on the one hand I was very grateful to be introduced to centering prayer through a spiritual director that I had met in the mid-2000s. I think it was 2005 or 2006, doing some service work for a volunteer organization that was working with disadvantaged children. And at the same time, I was studying at UCT, about to get into a master's program called Diversity Studies. It's very interesting when I think about it, because I think why I wanted to study diversity studies is to try and figure out what is it about this experience of difference, of these different axes of difference that exist within society and within the human family: race, class, gender, ability, religion, class, that happened to land on me and within my being. So it was a way of trying to figure out how how and why I'm having these particular experiences as a black woman in South Africa. And then doing this service work with this volunteer organization and being almost at the coalface of poverty, of inequality, like actually seeing how young children who are born free, who are born in this free South Africa, and whose parents and grandparents and their parents before them were fighting against apartheid and this idea of separateness. And still in this free South Africa, they don't have access to particular opportunities. They wake up hungry, they don't have parents, and all of that. So then for me, the centering prayer practice was really about me trying to come to terms with who I am in this particular body. I'd reflect on it now, and to a certain extent, that's what it was about. And with each, for any of you who practice centering prayer, introducing the sacred word, which is about consenting to God's action within, was about letting go, for me, of some of that shame, some of that guilt, some of the unworthiness and undeserving that I continuously felt and found in my interactions with people who look like you, right? And was met with it every day in different contexts. In many senses, I was very invisible. I was very invisible to a lot of white people walking in the world. I wasn't somebody who necessarily mattered. And so there was some certain willingness within for me to surrender to that particular identity and actually discover, who am I? Who am I without my blackness? Who am I without my gender? Who am I without my youth, my culture, and all of that? And discovering, and with my own particular history and childhood trauma, and everything that comes with that, and trying to figure out and get to the heart of what it means to be God's child, what it means to be a divine being that just happens to be walking and existing in this physical world. So I was very grateful to meet you at the retreat, and well, we'd met before, but it was the centering prayer experience that sort of was another level of connection that we had, because there was a sensing. I spoke about, okay, so why am I the only black person here? And you were able to kind of meet me where I was at, and I feel like that's sort of the conversation that we sort of need to be having. And how do we hold space as human beings? How do we hold space within the larger expanded beingness, right? So the retreat was very much about how do we grow our being in ways that can honor my humanity, honor yours, and also transcend this idea of what separateness is. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for me, Zanele, I love what you're saying about what does it mean to be a divine being, manifesting in a particular form, and then a form that happens to be a black woman or a white Afrikaans descended male or a North American woman. What does it matter? Because these particularities matter. But if we allow them to separate, we've stopped short of what's really possible. And I think I remember using an image when we were at the retreat about how when you have a stained glass window, you have little bits of red pieces and you have little bits of orange and little bits of green, and you put them all together and it takes every one of them to make a shape, and then the light flows through them and pulls them all into a whole. And so it's a kind of funky model, but it's a model in which separation is valid and contained and perceivable, but it's for the purpose of a greater unity. And Teilhard de Chardin was very much into that, of course, that his whole principle of evolution was that evolution moves forward by what he called complexification consciousness, where bits and pieces, all with very, very separate identities, and natures and even functions, are able to come together to form a whole that has emergent properties. They coalesce. They don't separate politically and put people in barricades, but they form a whole new unit, just like cells jumping together to form a human being. It's a quantum leap in what's capable. And my own sense and my own faith is that somewhere beyond, in a place that I taste through contemplative practice, we can reach that place where particularity doesn't divide us, but empowers us. You know, and it's good that you're a black woman, and it's good I'm a white woman, and it's good that you're an Afrikaner guy, you know. This is the stuff of building a new body of humanity. But for me, the real problem is exactly what you mentioned, Wilhelm, a little bit, is when we have this separate mentality, and I agree with you 100%, that separation is built right into us, and it goes really, really, really deep. But I think it goes deeper than just cultural conditioning or tribal instinct. I think it's built into the way our operating system in our normal brain works, because our mind, our rational brain, runs this system of perception through differentiation. And even the Buddhists tell you that it starts to set in at about 7 months old. They call it the first skanda that drops down to separate you from reality. And it happens when you realize that you and your mom are not continuous anymore. You have to cry and scream to get fed. And then from there on, the world in increasingly complex, points of bondage, divides the world into subject-object, I being the center, everything out in the outside, you, me. It tends to like to set them up in reciprocal opposites, black, white, male, and then maneuver and manipulate and compare and contrast. It's all the operating system of the normal binary brain. And I don't think it can be transcended by that brain at that level. It's the great mistake of liberal progressive Christianity, because they're speaking all the rhetoric and longing of unity, and yet the brain is still perceiving by separation. And you walk into the room and you become anguishingly aware that you're a white guy in a white environment, and then there's all these black people out there that our crew has done horrible things to. So you're still seeing through that veil of separation with all the anguish that it brings. But there's that other level that the contemplative tradition has always spoken about, although in cryptic language a little bit, that when there's a complete change in operating system, and of course they weren't talking that way in the days of the cloud of unknowing, that no computers back then, but when you start running a different system, when you upgrade to Sierra or whatever, which they saw very clearly happens when your mind is in your heart. Yeah. And your mind, this doesn't just mean when your brain gets emotional. What it means is that physiologically, neurologically, something happens so that brain wave is entrained to the heart wave, and the whole thing forms an unbroken organ of perception. Then you no longer run the perception through discrimination program. You can perceive through unity and harmony, like the way an orchestra conductor perceives. When she brings down her baton on the Mahler Symphony of 1,000, and in one measure you've got 100 different instruments playing. And you hear the whole thing as one sonorous whole, not first the cellos, and then the violins, and then the blacks, and then the whites. But you hear the harmony of the whole thing. And the heart can do that. And for me, that's the whole point of contemplative practice and why it is prophetic and collective, because it's absolutely the only route we have in our common universal cultural condition that's actually actively working on transforming the nature of the brain so that it can run unity, so that it can see from unity, and see from unity not by sort of syncretism or averaging or wiping out differences and lowest common denominator. It can see the excruciating particularity and suchness of each thing, but in a way that understands that they are all like cellos and tubas and violins in one symphonic column of divine love.
I mean, one of the things that I find very helpful about the practice is linked to the difficulty of the journey of getting to that ideal, in a sense that you've described. We want to get to the point of having a more unitive consciousness in the midst of our diversity, but why is it so difficult to get there? And I'm fascinated by this challenge of going into the depths, or like we say, go into the roots, or go, be grounded. But that means you have to find a way to sit in darkness, which is scary, which is losing control, which is being vulnerable, which is psychologically and spiritually a very, very uncomfortable place to be. And I think there's something about this gap between what we're trying to achieve and then we just can't get there. I think it has something to do with our struggle to go into those darknesses. I mean, leaving aside the metaphors for race, that is all get very confused. But this has been for me quite a helpful part of it, the cloud, the idea of going into a space of not being able to see, of not being in control. And one of my colleagues who has done a lot of work around peace work, and who comes from a background of violence, he was involved as a young person in violence. He talks about this journey towards the humanity of the other as a deeper, darker journey. And not just darker in the contemplative sense of the word, like this deep sense of, I suppose, the dark night of the soul kind of darkness too. And it seems to me that our culture and the way we teach ourselves in school and in church, we're not equipped and supported in those dark places. And that, I think, is something that I find very helpful, to learn to sit with that on a day-by-day basis, and gradually your capacity grows a bit. That's the one angle that I think perhaps resonates with you as well.
Yeah, that aspect of sitting with the discomfort, and I've often experienced that. In my centering prayer practice of, I guess it's that aspect of letting go when I'm met with like my own, like, I guess, false self and defensive,ness, and needing to trust, needing to in the letting go, to just trust in God's infinite mercy on the one hand. And I think it's only when that happens, certainly for me, so I think I mentioned that I do the gender reconciliation work, which is about trying to heal and transform the divisions along gender lines between women and men. And I have my own sort of father wounding, and a lot of what I was working in my centering prayer practice was how to come to those terms of forgiveness, or even if not forgiveness, but a sense of being completely in myself, regardless of what my father does or doesn't do, that I'm not attached to outcome in any particular way. And it took years, it's taken years and years and years. And what I discovered within myself is that I needed to completely trust in God's infinite mercy first, not before anything, and then once I experience that, I need to give it to my Father, give it to somebody else. I was walking on the beach earlier today, and I find it so amazing when the waves like wash up onto the sand and completely wash away all the tracks on the beach sand. And for me, that serves sort of as a metaphor of God and who God is, of being able to just completely wipe the slate clean, and you can make fresh footprints, like on the next wave or on another day. And I feel like that sort of serves as that. Like, and so in the process with my father, it wasn't necessarily forgiveness, but just a transformation of consciousness, I guess, like within myself, to be able to see him as who he fully was and come from that place. So I guess in there is a a bit of a personal experience piece, but also I think there a question of like, where does forgiveness then come in, like in this kind of physical realm, if we're then tying it to race or gender or whatever, because we're so much in this tension and conflict as, you know, as we identify in our physical bodies. So maybe that's a question that you can also sort of maybe touch on, and where the interplay is in that regard.
You know, what I hear in both of you is that when you speak about I, it sounds like the I is a steady point, you know, and it's been part of the spiritual training that I've had, and also my own perception, is the I is not steady, and the I is not one. And I actually, when I work with myself, I can kind of clearly pick out 4 different I's inside me. It's almost like a little moving lens. There's the I that's very, very much caught up in my drama. Me at my most automatic, neurotic, you know, false self, as Thomas Keating would call it, stuff. Then there's an I that's done its psychological work and is much more of a high egoic functioning I, fairly clear on my story, own my history, done my reconciliation work, working on my forgiveness, but it's still the narrative I. It's still the I that says I was born into a family constellation, I moved along a journey, I had a certain amount of wounding, a certain amount of pleasure, and as long as this I's in the driver's seat, God is still going to look like kind of a force out there that that will sweep the sand clean and start again, and I remain to make more footprints. But beyond that is what the classic Eastern traditions have called in various ways the witnessing self, that's unboundaried and knows absolutely that identity does not lie in that narrative story. That narrative story is more like the stern wake that falls out of a boat whose bow is ever pointed somewhere else. And so the journey from the narrative self to the witnessing self is like moving from the stern of the boat looking backwards to moving to the bow of the boat looking out at the heading. And it's the part about that that's so hard is that by and large the psychological professions that are writing the script for the healing work, for the reconciliation work, for the sociological work, all sort of enthrone the narrative self as the real, solid, non-moving I, and then try and fix the situation around it. Where if you can just get to a real strong, firm taste of that unboundaried self, that I call, you know, that spirit self as it enters this container, then you have an identity that not only can hold you safe and free and shameless and forgiven through the fray, but can also move out through the portal of your heart into the world to confer that freedom outwardly. So for me, there was an old terminology, there was an old slogan in the work that we were working on: you can't move a plank you're standing on. And as long as we're relying on our narrative self, I maintain the narrative self is incapable of forgiveness because it is holding on too hard to the story. And as long as the story is part of your core identity, you're stuck because you can't let it go because it's what you think is your identity. So forgiveness becomes conditional forgiveness. You know, I'll forgive you if you don't let it happen again. Whereas real forgiveness is like the sand. It wipes it clean. Done. Over. Don't look back. You don't need to look back. You move on into the new, and the narrative. I mean, when Elie Wiesel set the bar on this one, he made it really impossible, I think, for everybody, because he makes essentially forgiveness impossible, because if you stop telling the story, you're going to be encouraging re-perpetration. And that's become so much a part of the culture, and it is a part of the culture for narrative selfhood, that people can't move beyond it because they feel that they're then betraying, they're betraying their victim solidarity. And I think it's a trap that really is a trap built into the level shift between two kinds of self. I really believe that if that witnessing consciousness could be stabilized more, you begin to get people who look a little bit more like the Dalai Lama, like Thomas Merton, like Thomas Kelly, the great Quaker activist, that can see soberly and lucidly and without evasion, without sugar coating. But still what flows through it is forgiveness as a new energy of rebooting.
Yeah, and this is now the white South African eye, perhaps, or the Verwoerd eye. I do see. I mean, the image that I find helpful is of a wagon wheel. I mean, it's an ancient image. You know that, in a sense, my egoic self is the outer rim of the wheel, and that there's a deep self rooted in God, and actually God's self in me, which goes beyond all of the. But you need both. You need the outer rim, and you need the center of the wheel. So for me, that's the deep self and the shallow self, or the outer self. But in the South African context, when we speak in the way that you are speaking now, as a white South African, it becomes often very problematic, because the way we use forgiveness, or we expect black South Africans to forgive, or even if we say we want to apologize, we put pressure on people to forgive, I think that often becomes a way of actually not facing our responsibility. And that many people have said to me, I don't want to even talk about forgiveness anymore because it's lost all meaning, or even reconciliation has become this kind of cheap thing where it's really about maintaining my white privilege and not willing to face. So I think for me that's the challenge, to go to that witnessing self, to go to the deep self, but to remember this is connected with the particular. And in our context, I'm even uncomfortable with using the language forgiveness. And in the Northern Irish context, where I've worked a lot, people started to talk about compassion, humanization, connectedness, in this context, Ubuntu, interrelatedness, before we get to the language of forgiveness. And I don't know if that resonates with you, but I sometimes worry that when somebody like me starts to use that language, it really is about wanting to get rid of this burden. And that actually we need to take the burden as a cross in the sense of the Christian cross, and in the taking and in the facing, it becomes transformed into renewed humanity in relationship with the other, not on my own, sitting on my little cushion meditating, but midwifed by relationships with the other. In this case, so many black South Africans have been the midwives of my liberation without necessarily using the language of forgiveness. So I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, because if that doesn't happen, then the burden falls on me, the black person, to carry that. And that was a little bit of my question in the retreat around what my particular post is, right? As being the only black person in the room, right? So on the one hand, I also find, the terminology around forgiveness problematic for that very same reason, and at the same time. And I don't know which kind of I am, but I know that I'm certainly reaching a point where, and I shared it with you, that I can, to a certain extent, have compassion for white people, because there's a certain part of me that understands that, some of the action is coming out of ignorance, some of that action is coming out of projection of whatever it is happening inwardly, but projected out onto me or whoever it is that is regarded as other. And yet at the same time, I'm very uncomfortable to own that, and that I have some discomfort with that compassion, because yes, being the only black person in the room, I feel like I represent more than myself. So I'm not just, I'm not just me. I have thousands and, however many black people who are in the constant struggle, who experience anger, who experience pain, frustration, and suffering on a day-to-day because of whiteness, right? And so I feel to a certain extent I carry that burden. So in as much as I can do this work with you as an individual or as this particular I that you show up as, there is still another level of work that needs to happen, and I'm grappling with that. And that's the constant tension that I have. So where should I, whatever I that is, move, within that? So I feel that.
Yeah, I suppose that was one of the questions I was sitting with in terms of how you also see that kind of almost collective aspect of the I, which even if I as an individual can transform, go through contemplation and so on, when I meet a person of color, I still represent the system, the group, the privilege, and it evokes pain, irrespective of what I do or say or feel as an individual. And I can make the distinction, and the contemplative practice is helping to sit with that discomfort.
Yeah.
To know that this is a reality we have to find a way through. I can't now go back and say, no, I'm enlightened, or I'm, not any longer, following in the footsteps of my grandfather. But the point is, when you hear my name, it still brings up the pain associated with the system.
Yeah.
And I need to face that systemic part of my, I don't know if it's my I, but my presence in relation with the other.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense.
I don't know what to say, and in a way I'm disenfranchised from speaking from the beginning, because as I said right at the start, I live in a bubble.
Okay.
And I haven't had a direct, I haven't lived through myself the kind of brutality and atrocity and systemic violence that, it was just one step removed from me as a grandchild of the Civil War in America, as a Southerner whose parents fled north. And watching the whole racial thing just explode again. I mean, what America is heading into right now, they should all be reading South African history, because we're doing it all over again there, with the same sort of motivations. But, so being mindful that I'm walking on very, very thin ice here, that I found in my own work that I've had a strong calling to work with international groups, much more strong to go around the world than to stay and teach in America. And so I've sat with some Buddhists on Holy Island, Scotland. We were working together where they're having a very interesting program of trying to beam a specific kind of fine energy into the world. It's quite subtle what they're up to. And I've sat with groups in New Zealand that are trying really in a similar way to try and invite the strong, vibrant Maori presence into their contemplative groups, so it doesn't just become a copy of a North American formula, but brings this heart and soul and a few other places around the world. But I guess what my perspective really is that in South Africa, you're coming out of a very intense and very particular piece of history, and still very, very close to the woundedness of this, that you still see yourself as the privileged caste. And in a sense, that's true. I don't think it's going to be true for much longer. That when you look at the world from the point of view of again, a Teilhardian point of view, where you take the long range of evolution and you look at it with some of the maps that come from the inner traditions of what human responsibilities are, the white colonial race has made a mess of the planet. It's made a mess of the planet in its arrogance, in its disembodiment, in its isolationism, in its greed, in its separation from real, genuine presence. I mean, I find essentially the white cultural race, as it's come to have played itself out today, is a species which is really properly on the edge of cosmic extinction, you know? And I really see this around the world. And I see that there are little places where we're holding back the dams. That, you know, in America we've got another upwelling of this, you know, this white male tribalism. Of course, we got to keep all of them out, or else we're going to lose our us. You know, and it's hit this country big time. But it's doomed, because the color that the world is going to be is brown, because people are meeting, and because they're intermarrying, and because the cultures are touching, and they're singing, and the internet is there. And because human beings have not contributed, what is our requirement on the planet? We're not required. We're not supposed to be filling the world with shopping malls and greed and separation and gated compounds and churches that are locked. We're not supposed to be doing that. We're supposed to be sending up into the world from the transformed fruit of our life grace, forbearance, forgiveness, joy, gentleness, all those gifts and fruits of the Spirit. They're actually atmospheres. They're physical, psychophysical energies, which are required for the planet as much as good rain and good earth. And I believe that a lot of the, you know, climate change is not a hypothetical possibility. We're into it. We're into it deep. We're already a generation that's seen the shores washing away on what we know. It's, you know, that I believe very strongly that we're on the edge of a cosmic correction, and that these little barricades and compounds of white privilege are local phenomenon, and that it doesn't look that way right now, but I think it is. And I find that there's some good measure that I've been put down to work with white folks. I don't feel like I've somehow betrayed my greater human calling by doing that, because they're the endangered species. And they're basically the problem causers. If it weren't for all of our crap, you know, you wouldn't be having this. I mean, you don't see this kind of hoarding and refusal to share and refusal to form communities in any of the other races of the world except the white race. Nowhere else would you have gated communities. Nowhere else would you have people not coming together on the streets for community dinners. Nowhere. There's something really sick about how the culture has elaborated itself. And we're already into the edge of a cultural, you know, the universe, which is created by God and which is all about goodness and transformation and the fullness of love, is going to have to make the correctives. And so for me, the real ministry, and the only way I can do it, is to work with the people that come before me, who are willing, in the crew I mostly work with, to do the work of the growth of consciousness. And my sense is that when the white community reaches a level where they're really genuine and authentic in it, then it's going to be easy to reach out and make a bridge. You know, not to the black community or not to the Maori community, because we won't see them as blacks or Maoris. We'll see them as fellow human beings, having to pull together to build a new planetary species. And I never lose sight of that goal. You know, it's bigger than even South Africa. And from my brothers and sisters in the world, I gain the strength day by day to work in the particularity that I've been granted to hold the post in. That we can really build a new human community that will do what human beings need to do before the planet has to get taken back to the geosphere again because of the sins we've put on it.
Sure. You don't often hear white South Africans speak like that, do you?
And just to that point, I've just sort of observed that in different cultures and traditions, there seems to be a reclaiming of ancient traditions and sacred customs and rituals to try and, I think, do the very same thing that you're speaking to. So I think that's a part where that resonates for me.
Yeah, we need the help. I had the experience this winter of spending about a month and a half cruising in the Caribbean with a friend of mine on a sort of small sailboat. And it was funny because, of course, the Caribbean lives on these two levels. That you've got the incredible ultra wealthy gated playgrounds of the Europeans and the Americans and the yachts and all that, and you've got a kind of service industry that services them, and then just back from the roads you've got the various poor. But last fall these two hurricanes ripped through there back to back, and basically what they did was rip the veneer off the pleasure culture. You now have these luxury hotels that were just there in little gated communities, and the gates are hanging sideways, and there's blue tarps on the roof, and looting and raiding, and all sorts of chaos, and rental sailboats upside down in the water, and I thought, I'm looking at a foretaste of what the world may look like. And in this, what was really interesting is that the communities that used to be hidden just back a block or so off the main streets, we're now right out there in front. And the whole culture was, in a way, just wonderful and warm and throbbing and interactive again, as the white folks that got pulled in were brought into the culture that could finally receive them. I spent Mardi Gras dancing on the streets in Fort-de-France and in Martinique with this completely black community. I mean, I and this other guy I was with were the only white people in this wonderful Mardi Gras feathers, and it was just in a way, a delicious foretaste of the survival power of humanity. And I had my first experience of being, really literally the only white person. And I was stunned to discover that it really didn't make any difference to me,
I was just wondering, because I'm from a facilitation point of view, I'm interested in what kind of practices, what kind of processes can support people when we don't have hurricanes coming and do the work for us. If we have to do the work.
Or the water crisis.
Or the water crisis. But and I'm thinking specifically of people coming from, say, the background that I'm coming from. But also internationally, I think one of the things that really stood out was that often what is the key to break through some of these rigid, enclosed kind of identities is some kind of cross-border compassion. And I'm not talking about pity, like the Buddhists would say. That's the near enemy of compassion.
Exactly.
Because it's not really vulnerable, it's not about risk, it's not about courage. But so we're talking about people's willingness to go into a space of vulnerability and connect deeply with the pain of the other. And I have this belief that we need to prepare ourselves to go into those spaces. And I think that's where contemplative practice really helps. But even in the practice of sharing our stories, being together, we need the kind of capacity, the spiritual energy to hold that compassion and then translate it into action. So this for me has been a helpful way to phrase this connection between contemplation and action, is to think in terms of contemplation and cross-border compassion. I don't know if that resonates.
But surely it starts with oneself, right? Okay. So I really feel there's a level of work that we each have to do with ourselves and in us. Find that compassion within ourselves. I think it's very hard, near impossible to give compassion to another when we haven't touched the depths of it ourselves. And I'm coming back to that aspect of infinite mercy, like that came to me on the water. Like, I had to experience it myself. Then only could I grant it, I don't know if that's the correct term, to my father. Like, I couldn't unless I experienced it. Otherwise, then it's just some kind of, putting a Band-Aid on a really gushing wound and thinking, okay, it's all fixed. We're all happy and dandy. So yeah, to a certain extent, I feel like that cross stuff, the cross-border stuff is really necessary. And at the same time, it's got to come from one's own experience of it first. Yeah. So I guess that's that white work and black work, if we're talking about it in race terms. In the gender work, like women come together and men come together, or whatever that looks like, and then there's a coming together and a meeting of hearts in that way as a next level of work.
I mean, I mentioned it to you too, but I've just come out of a deep process of trying to practice that with my father and grandfather. So what does compassion mean with that? So I think, again, the contemplative practice was very helpful to actually say, I need to accept myself in my brokenness. That doesn't mean forgiveness, but this kind of compassionate, loving acceptance. But that's boundaryless, so it has to include him as well.
Yeah.
But what does that mean now? Okay, so that doesn't mean I'm excusing or I'm denying or I'm exculpating, but there's a human connection.
Yeah.
And then I have the energy to say, this is compassion without boundaries.
Yeah.
And then to experience often in the arms or in the encounter with black South Africans where I don't deserve it, to be accepted in my humanity. And that's where Ubuntu then comes alive. Not in a romantic kind of commercialized sense, but this kind of real sense of in our relationship, I become alive. And that's the way to get out of the gated communities, is to say, here is a message of life and liberation, which is not easy, but that's the message for me of the contemplative practice. It's deeply liberating, but very difficult.
It's funny. I was thinking back as you were speaking. I'm really asking, have I ever felt either compassion for myself or somebody having compassion on me? And I don't have a real strong resonant feeling with either of them. I can't think of a moment in my life where I knew that I was forgiven or that it was okay. I have no idea about either one of them. It just sort of seems that I'm here, and that I continue to be here, and I'll be here for as long as I can, and it seems better to sort of, it always works better as you extend compassion towards others in the simple act of presence. And that what comes back, and sometimes it's just a matter of learning, for me to get out of my hiding behind my eyes and just plant my feet on the floor and actually look at somebody. And actually be here when I'm talking. And at the moment I'm actually here and looking at you and not looking at a quick photograph. Oh yeah, that's Zanele, but meeting you eye to eye and then heart to heart, there's a different kind of quality of being that comes through it. And I don't know whether I think if compassion means anything, it comes closer to that kind of feeling of real connection with another one as an equal. But I've often heard, it's a great saying out in the work that first you have to forgive yourself before you can forgive others. And all I can say is that I have not yet empirically grounded that in my being yet. I've heard it, but I don't know that's true. That Dostoevsky says it works in the opposite way. That you begin by the simple extension of love, and finally through that you come to know that love comes to you as well. So very much work in progress for me.
Thank you for that.
So I think we could pause just for a moment. I know, Cynthia, you wanted, in a way, you wanted us to sit in silence just for a little. So before we go into the next phase, if you like, into questions from all of you, I'd just like to invite us all to allow what we've heard, to allow this extraordinary conversation that we've heard, just to settle with us for a few moments. And Cynthia, you can bring us out of the silence.
Okay,
In about 5
certainly,
minutes.
yeah. Not more than 5 minutes, but it will be a time to let some of these really deep things from the heart that have been said settle in the room and in all of us. And if on the other side of that, any of you have a question or a comment that you'd like to share with us, there'll be some space for that, right, Emma? Okay, so let's sit for a few minutes.
Good evening. Thank you for this evening. I would like any one of you to address the topic of surrender. I just find it so central to whether it's the practice of centering prayer or engaging with any other part of creation. And I'd just like to hear what you might have to say about that.
Well, I guess I can lead off that it's a pity that so many of the words that are really crucial in the vocabulary of the spiritual life have taken on completely negative associations in the physical and political realm. And surrender is one of those words, which in the political sense is always thought of as capitulating to a dominant force, usually a hostile dominant force. And so it's a word that becomes very, very reprehensible. I remember once sitting in a church gathering with women, most of whom had been nuns, who were telling Father Thomas Keating in no uncertain terms, that surrender was not a word that they were going to accept in any spiritual vocabulary, because they'd had 300 years at least of surrendering. But in the spiritual sense, the word means almost exactly the opposite. And if you just break it apart in the link of it, surrender, to hand yourself over, it's first of all a relational word. It presumes a relational field. And in the classic spiritual sense, it's the capacity to hand yourself over into that higher intelligence. And whether you consider it that higher intelligence is residing in your own deepest inner knowing, or in that witnessing self, or in God, or in a benevolent universe. What happens is that you make space, you let go of your insistence at a certain level, and make space for a larger possibility. Neurologically, what that looks like is that you get out of your amygdala with its fight and flight response and invite your prefrontal lobes to kick in again and your heart to kick in. So it is a way of engaging the power of a more active spiritual intelligence. And surrender is always accessed through the gate of a practice which allows you to let go. Because when you're not surrendered, at least spiritually, it's because you're clinging on to something for dear life. This is not acceptable. I can't have this. I won't. And if you learn to open your hands, not only do you not tend to lose what you were most afraid of losing, but you gain the active re-accessing of more of your body, and you bring yourself into a greater entrainment with the cosmos. So the practice of centering prayer, which is a repeated practice of letting go of thoughts as you find your mind is clamping onto them, is actually patterning in as a kind of subtle neurological gesture, letting go. And little by little, after you practice it in the prayer period, you find that it becomes more and more a default response in life. That when something hits you like this, rather than immediately punching back, you learn to do the open up. And you often find that you see a new possibility that you didn't see before, or come at things with the better force or the better timing. So surrender is sort of understood in that way, is your classic go-to gateway spiritual practice uniting contemplation and action. So that's my take. Any of you want to refine or reverse?
Well, it might come up in another question, but I think for me, this has really been the experience, also especially in the last period of intense engagement with this kind of this group and other identities and what it means to be privileged and all of those things. But that kind of patterning of letting go, a kind of more spacious, open-handed relation with whoever you engage with, has been very liberating. It still doesn't come naturally. I mean, there's still the reactive stuff that happens, but the kind of constant, like non-judgmental, compassionate practicing has really been helpful. And again, I mean, it doesn't mean giving up. It doesn't mean not being real and being you, but there's something about the spirit of spaciousness which for me is so different to how I grew up, which was really like this. And this kind of, it's so countercultural and counterintuitive, but deeply liberating.
I think the only thing I would add is just how I've used that in the gender reconciliation work that I do, and how, and recognizing we as facilitators, that having a contemplative practice is absolutely essential to doing the particular gender work that we do, because we're, going against thousands and thousands of years of a patriarchal system. And so for me as a facilitator, in particular moments where I have absolutely no idea what to do, as a facilitator, I can just connect in and just surrender to this larger divine force and will to work through me. And so all that I do is I serve as an instrument for whatever the divine will and wisdom that is needed in the moment in order to shift a particular thing, or have a different way of seeing what it is that needs to happen and what needs to shift. So I think it's again that aspect of the muscle. So the more I practice surrender, the more I'm strengthening that muscle within, that I can be able to act, listen, open up, and respond in a different way that I normally would have. Yeah.
Question for Zanele. Question for you, Zanele. In your opinion, in South Africa, is Ubuntu on the rise or on the decline?
Sure. That's a very tough question. I would say I think outwardly it would look like it's on the decline, and at the same time I'm part of very many activist circles where I've seen and just witnessed the coming together of people in the face of such struggle and tragedy, and the willingness for people to give up of themselves for the sake of somebody else. So, and I witnessed that a lot in many of the circles that I'm in, particularly in the recent student social movement that's happened with the fees must fall and the roads must fall. With the recent protests, I was just chatting with a friend of mine in Mitchell's Plain, because of the recent stuff that's been happening, and how just opening up their homes for people. So I think when on the outside, if you kind of look at the news media, you'll see all the negative stuff and how people are very much like this, and not to say that that's not true. And at the same time, when you're connected in and involved and looking at, there's a deeper level of seeing that I've witnessed in terms of how people are really drawing together. So I would say yes. I would say yes. It's on the increase. Oh, it's just been sustained. It's just about what is it that we see.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Cynthia, you spoke about, I think you mentioned 4 eyes. Mm-hmm. I think you stopped at the third one. I'd like to hear the 4th one, if that's possible.
The eyes, the false self, the nafs in Sufi term, that little conditioned dramatic self, the narrative self, the high egoic function that I sometimes call soul, the spirit, that voice, that divine light, that conscience, that always higher voice that speaks within you and calls you to your higher self. And then this mysterious one that emerges that I call heart. And it's really, really different because it's got some of the intuition of that higher side, but it's practical and it's embodied, and it always says, do this now, and do it without story. It's almost like the lion in winter that comes roaring out of the heart to simply act. And I would say that's probably the witnessing self in action through the heart. I don't taste it enough. My vision is if you ever came together in one point, that would be my point of highest reconciliation, because it's really the reconciliation between that kind of logoic self that's always a little beyond you, that kind of higher vision of yourself, and your sort of narrative self that's stuck in its own event horizon and can't get out. This thing is sort of like the Christos, the overlap of the two, that's both fully divine and fully human, and knows how to move in the world. And you only taste it. I mean, at least I only taste it in small places situationally, but when I taste it, I say, aha, so that's what it is,
Within the space of contemplative practice, what role do you believe within the white space does lament play? Black people in this country have been lamenting for decades and continue to lament. Within the white space, what does that look like?
I suppose that's a question to me. I mean, Afrikaans, I find it fascinating that the word for remorse is berou. And berou means there's a mourning. Rou is mourning. It's rawness as well, but it's also mourning. And one of the questions I've been sitting with is, what does it really mean to have remorse? Like in the sense of going through a proper mourning process in the face of what we have done to a fellow human being individually and collectively. And in my culture, we don't know how to do that. We don't even know how to cry. Definitely not in public. So how do you, these deep, deep tears that go deep within the core of your being, how do we find a way to bring some of that out? In a way that's not about only my own healing, it's in the face of the suffering of the other. So it's got to be relational. And it's got to be ritual. I don't think you can do it with words. We need to, there's these shared rituals that we need. And perhaps we might have to start in white spaces. Perhaps we might have to start in white male spaces to get some of the men to cry, in particular, especially the men who've been through the army. Like there's hundreds of thousands of white men who are sitting with that militarization, and it's not being dealt with. So that's also holding back, I think, some of the remorse, because it's vulnerable. It makes you feel like a softie, so it's all of the masculinity and all of those things that need to be challenged. So we've got a huge challenge, but I really believe we need to do that. And do it for the sake also of our shared humanity. So thank you for that question.
Yeah.
We'll just take two more questions.
So I was going to ask more or less the same question, but then maybe to Cynthia. You said something about compassion as identifying and connecting with the victim or one you are extending compassion to. How would you move past that and actually identify with? Because I think as people, we've been good with this thing of playing with words and saying, I'm with you, but you still see the structures and the hindrances that this person, they can see, they feel me, they hear me, but they are not identifying with me. And also, maybe as a victim, as the one who's being reached out to, what should be your response when you don't see anything happening, but people are saying there?
It's a difficult question, and the one thing that I know about compassion, and Wilhelm, you've said this very clearly, and it can't be stated enough, is that compassion is not pity. And that a lot of what we get in trouble with when you have class separation, and you talk about the entitled class having compassion for the others, is that power differential is still built in. And before you have compassion, you have to have the power differential wiped out, because compassion is among equals. I think that was the point that Jesus was getting at in the story of the Good Samaritan. That everybody else was saying, oh, the poor Samaritan, you know, the poor unentitled person, shall we have pity on him? And he's the one who comes up and actually does the action. It's an empowerment. So for me, one of the greatest schools for the beginning to practice of compassion has been when you're actually in love with a person, because it wipes out, you know, you got to be equals. And you got to have a taste that so much of what we think is compassion is not. So the question for me is, first of all, of how you actually strike a place of equality. And then second, how you move out of that, as your question says, into naming systemic inequality and working with it. You know, I've not been called to take that step so much in the own work we do. I've found that some of the groups in which compassion in terms of equality works best is when you're doing things like making music or making arts or making dancing, where you need everybody and everybody is equal. In sports, another great place, that there are structures where that kind of equality is already so built in, that we really get to practice and see what it means to go beyond these kind of habitual entitlements that we carry into the practice. And I can only say that I think you've named a very, very real question, and that it's the next step in all our growths of transparency and interbeing.
I know Zani wants to ask a question, so I'm going to give the last question to Zanele.
I think I did see another hand up, though. There was a hand.
Oh, Barry, let's give you...
Thank you. I don't mind giving the last question to Zanele.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you for such an interesting discussion, Zanele. It's lovely to see you again. So I recently had the privilege of listening to a panel of Black American preachers unpacking their history. And it was fascinating to me because they were brutal, absolutely brutal. But at the end of the day, each one of these people had something deeply authentic of their own religion that they could still take home with them. So I would like to know from you, particularly you, Wilhelm, but also Zanele, how do you hold on to an authentic faith on which the past was largely built? Thank you.
Great. Great question.
That's a good question. Thank you. I think it's been for me personally. It's been an interesting journey for me because I call myself a recovering Catholic. So like there's this aspect of me that's completely sort of pulled away from the structures and the dogma of the Catholic Church, and I guess Christianity as how it's known, and also have to face all the wounding that's come with and the colonial history and the patriarchy within that. And if I take all of that away, including Christianity and Catholicism, and didn't necessarily have that as a religion, spirituality would be the Ubuntu that I experience as an African. It would also be a rich ancestral lineage. So it's very much so when I say, what I was saying earlier about me being, say, the only black person in the room, there's another aspect to it, which is I am not an individual. I am not myself. You may see just one of me, and yet I carry with me in my energy, in my presence, and in my lineage, all those that have come before me in my particular line. So that's what spirituality. That's what the spirituality would be for me. And so and that's true for whatever rituals that we have, ceremonies or customs. You're kind of calling on that larger body that is that you are part of, but that's also almost beyond you, that you draw from for who you are, and that comes through in the names that you get given when you're born. Like my name is Zanele, which is the name of the last born girl that is born into the family. And at the same time, what it means is complete, you know. And you sort of, part of what that means is that I live that legacy out. I live into the legacy of what my name means, which is about bringing completion or coming into completion. And I continue to discover that in my life. So that's what I would say. So even without that, I feel like there is even a resonance with transforming of consciousness in the wisdom tradition is very much tied to what I feel I know in my being, even if there was no language, no sort of structure called, or religion called Christianity in the wisdom tradition through which that flows. I feel like there's something that operates at a much higher realm of that isn't even about our own kind of individual lives, but there's a larger spirited work where we find connections, and I draw from one aspect, one strand of that. Anyway, thank you.
I'll try to be brief. I have a very troubled relationship with my faith tradition, the Dutch Reformed tradition, as you can imagine, given its role as the state church and the official justification of the theology, really, of apartheid. And I felt deeply betrayed by that generation of leaders and the church in terms of what we were doing to fellow human beings in the name of our faith. And we were very religious, like when I grew up, like seriously religious. I was belonging to a little group called Warriors for Jesus, you know, so we were into missionary work and the whole thing. But there was a piety that I think was authentic, that was what was very impoverished, very blinded. And some of my spiritual journey, I think, has come to appreciate that there's something in that piety that has a lot of negative stuff, but there's something real about a real relationship with the divine. And that somehow, if that could just be unblocked and released, then we can begin to see ourselves as members of a much larger family of faith within the Christian tradition, but also with other faith traditions. I mean, for me, the beauty is that I discovered Cynthia's work at a Buddhist retreat on the west coast of Ireland. So there's a lovely way in which, in my own journey, I've become exposed to all these different traditions, but somehow I now find myself coming back, and I'm now based at the Beyers Naudé Center for Public Theology. And Beyers Naudé was a prophet, a profound prophet of the apartheid system from within that tradition. So I'm now looking for those ancestors, for those people within that tradition that I can also root myself and be part of this much bigger family of faith and spirituality, even beyond faith. Yeah.
Cool. So my question for Cynthia. What you're saying around giving forgiveness first is sort of still percolating for me, but my question is sort of around like what you mean by that, and if you could maybe give an example, because the only closest thing that I have for me in my mind around what that is maybe how this self-emptying that Jesus did or practiced. Is that what you meant at all, or?
It's very simple. I mean, you know, it even starts with watering my plants. And that as I discover in simple actions the capacity to bestow life, the capacity to bestow intimacy that lies within me. That one of the myths that I grew up with in my own formulation was the myth of intimacy, which sort of said that you can only get intimacy from a relationship, and so you have to go and find another party in a relationship, and then intimacy is what flows. So it turned into a search for another. And finally, through a lot of the work in centering prayer and others, I began to learn that intimacy is a natural property of the heart. It's a radiant field that I actually touch in centering prayer sometimes, and that my heart has the capacity to extend itself out, that intimacy, that objectless intimacy, to extend out to a houseplant, to a cat, to a bicycle that needs oil on its sprocket, to a person not in a huge way, but in a simple act of kindness and presence. And as I strengthen my own capacity to extend the radius of this life-giving intimacy which has somehow been placed inside me, then I find that I am included within that circle, you know? But it's not a one step of forgiving myself and then going out. It's just sort of trying to stay in the sensation of that intimacy, which is just this natural little field of my heart, and gradually widen it with a lot of errors. But when I do it that way, you know, race and color and gender and all that kind of stuff disappears, and narration disappears. You know, there have been stories of betrayal in my own sphere. A lot of them had to do with, you know, around the Roman Catholic Church closing its communion tables. And all of a sudden, you know, a circle of fellowship that I was once admitted to, and I would go and stay with Benedictine monasteries, was all of a sudden slammed shut, you know, in anger and rage and betrayal. And finally I realized that this was just story, you know, that they were going to do their thing for as long as they were going to do it, and then they were going to do a different thing, and that, you know, that I would find my own rebellion, but to extend the field of intimacy to the monks that are as much trapped in this, you know, this ridiculosity as we all are, would in a sense knock the edge off my own sense of betrayal and denial and exclusion, and allow me to be simply the one extending the intimacy. So at least I didn't get hurt anymore. And I guess I would say that's sort of the direction that the practice that's been most real for me has gone in, to discover the radiant capacities for healing that are already in my own heart by virtue of it being a heart. I won't even say a human heart, because dogs do it too, you know.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
We could go on and on, but that is a beautiful place to finish. Thank you so much. And I'd like to thank you to the three of you, for your courage and honesty and authenticity, and for so much that we've heard. But it's not my piece to do the thanks. I'm handing over to my daughter Sarah, who wants to add her vote of thanks on behalf of all of us.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah Oliver. And yeah, I get the best job of the night, which is to show gratitude. So firstly, to our amazing speakers and guests, a huge thank you. I feel like, yeah, you've taken us on a deep journey. I don't know if anyone else feels that, but I definitely felt like I've been taken on a journey through all of your stories and just glimpses of your stories to that deeper wisdom that we're all here to find. So thank you very much. And I think also what you've demonstrated here tonight in terms of that vulnerability and that honesty and heart connection, I really do believe that that's the call to action for all of us going forward from here. So a big thank you. And then just to say that the night, should we show appreciation for...